of the really important underlying conditions for a lot of global politics has been a fracture that's emerged both in the United States and in many other countries abroad. If you look at the election map in the United States, and particularly the reason why the Republicans won in the Electoral College, there's a very sharp divide between the party of the left, which was located in a number of very small but very concentrated urban areas on both of the coasts, and then in the area around Chicago and other large cities. And most rural areas and smaller cities and towns were solidly red. And that corresponded to a difference in terms of the core voters for the two parties. The Republican Party, the core base for Donald Trump tended to be less educated working class people, whereas the Democratic Party in a certain way has evolved into a party of white professionals and then a coalition of African Americans, Hispanics, environmentalists, other people of that sort. And the fundamental divide is really around class, where more educated people turned out to vote Democratic and less educated people voted Republican. This is actually the social basis of a lot of new, I would call it populist nationalism in many other parts of the world, not just in the United States. So in the Brexit vote to leave the European Union, the cosmopolitan elites in London voted to remain, whereas people in the rest of Britain, and particularly in smaller towns and cities, tended to vote to leave. But if you go further afield, Viktor Orban's Hungary or Vladimir Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey, you see the same kinds of social divisions. Erdogan is not popular in Istanbul and Ankara. Viktor Orban is not popular in Budapest. And Vladimir Putin is not particularly popular among more educated people in St. Petersburg and Moscow, but their power base is really elsewhere. It's in the majority of the country that is not part of that elite in the cities. And this is why I think there's actually a common social basis. There's also been a big issue with parties of the left which have not been responding to the kinds of popular working class complaints that they were originally meant to address. Most of the communist, socialist, and social democratic parties throughout Europe were working class parties at the beginning of the 20th century whose base was in the trade union movement and that tried to represent the proletariat. Increasingly, they have evolved in a way that that's no longer true. They tend to represent more middle class interests. So, for example, environmentalism has become very important to progressive people, less so this class divide. And in the meantime, a lot of working class voters that used to vote communist or socialist or social democratic in Europe, let's say in France, have now migrated over to the nationalist populist National Front of Marine Le Pen. And so for all of these reasons, you're seeing this very interesting transformation that's based on real transformations and ultimately an unhappiness with globalization. We've been living through a 40, 50-year period in which you've had ever-increasing trade through negotiated trade pacts, like institutions like the World Trade Organization, movement of capital and of people across the world in ways that really have been unprecedented since the early 20th century. And I think this has been leading to a lot of social dislocation and social confusion, and also confusion over identity, as well as to job loss in developed countries, which has been one of the side effects of the general prosperity being created by globalization. And so for all of these reasons, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the sociology of our changing global environment, because that is going to very much determine the politics for the future. I think that this division is dangerous in many respects, because inequality in itself is not a good thing, and it's now having effects that possibly can threaten both the liberal rule of law at home and the liberal world order internationally. It's as if the democratic part of liberal democracy is rising up and trying to chip away at the liberal part, asserting the dominant majority national identity against those of various kinds of minorities, pushing for national self-interest way ahead of international cooperation and the like. And if we're not careful, this can lead to a spiral of self-regarding nationalisms throughout the world system, and particularly because this is beginning to happen in many respects in the leading architect of that international system, which is the United States of America itself. So all of this is not preordained. We will have to see. There's a number of very important elections coming up in the year 2017, like the French presidential election, in which I think the future of institutions like the European Union will be determined. But it is something that will affect all of us depending on the way it goes. One of the reasons I think that the Democratic Party didn't win in the Electoral College has to do with the fact that in many respects it's become the party of identity politics. That is to say, Barack Obama won 2 elections based on mobilizing African Americans, Hispanics, women, especially middle class and professional women, and environmentalists who are largely middle class, a number of constituent groups of the Democratic Party, all of which in certain ways felt themselves to be aggrieved minorities that wanted to assert their identity against the majority. And then one of the things that's happened this year is that it has produced a kind of reaction on the right, where a lot of white voters felt that these various groups were pushing for special privileges or pushing in line ahead of them. And so for the first time, I think you've seen the entry into mainstream politics of some ideas that came out of fringe groups. White nationalism has become an issue that, we don't know how serious a phenomenon this is, but certainly there's been more attention paid to this kind of identity assertion in this year, in this competitive election year, than in previous years. And I think that in general, this is something that democracies need to worry about for a number of reasons. So first of all, although identity politics may begin with economic grievance, in the long run, it tends to divert attention away from economic injustice towards the assertion of solidarity across one's identity group. The classic example of this was in 1914, when the Marxists hoped that the workers of the world would unite against the capitalists, and instead they all lined up as Germans or Frenchmen or Englishmen in favor of their own national governments, fought a horribly bloody war in which the class issue was really not, was not important. And I think in many respects, you can see, the degree to which there's been a mobilization of the white working class, which has in certain respects subordinated its economic interests to solidarity with a kind of larger group. In any event, we will have to see how this develops, but it's something that could be troubling, because a democracy should not be simply a collection of heterogeneous identity groups that are all competing against one another. I think that democracies need to see things in universal terms, because democracies grant rights on a universal basis. They're based on a principle of fundamental human equality, and citizens are supposed to approach politics as citizens who have to reason in common about common problems that they face. And this is something that I think at the end of 2016 has become more difficult to do, because we've seen this fracturing of the American body politic, the growth of polarization and the growth of distrust across many groups in American society.